Welcome to The Explainer. I'm Justin Kace. Today, we're going back in time to examine a physical data breach. And not just any breach, but the unauthorized extraction, a completely rogue post-mortem jailbreak of the 20th century's greatest mind. You know, we spend a lot of time today worrying about our digital footprint, our passwords, who's scraping our personal data. But on the night Albert Einstein died, his most valuable asset was flat out stolen. And that sparked this wild, decades-long saga of hidden jars, bizarre science, and a massive, literal invasion of bodily privacy.
To really understand the gravity of this breach, we kind of have to look at the user agreement, so to speak. Despite the intense international recognition of his work, Albert Einstein absolutely hated all the fame. He hated the endless attention that came with it. He just wanted to be left alone to think. Because of this, he laid out highly specific terms of service for his death. He explicitly requested permanent, offline privacy. He dictated in his will that his body was not to be studied under any circumstances. He wanted his physical hardware destroyed completely, cremated, and his ashes scattered in a secret, unknown location. He wanted to leave absolutely nothing behind for the public to obsess over.
Okay, let's dive into this. Up until April 17, 1955, Einstein's health appeared pretty stable. But then excruciating stomach pains hit. His secretary rushed him to Princeton Hospital, and tragically, a few hours later, on the morning of April 18th, he passed away. Because this sudden complication really surprised his loved ones, the family asked the hospital to perform a standard autopsy, just to establish the exact cause of death. And that is exactly when a pathologist named Dr. Thomas Harvey stepped up to the table.
Now, to understand the fragile state of Einstein's physical hardware at the time, you have to look at a rather absurd medical patch he received years prior. During the autopsy, Dr. Harvey found a massive amount of blood in Einstein's abdomen. The cause of death was quickly identified as a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Basically, a blood vessel had burst, causing fatal internal bleeding. But what's incredibly bizarre here is how Einstein had actually survived a similar threat years earlier. Back in 1948, a surgeon named Dr. Rudolf Nissen performed an absolutely absurd hardware patch on him. He literally wrapped Einstein's aortic aneurysm in cellophane. Yes, you heard me right, everyday cellophane. This triggered a bodily reaction that miraculously prevented a rupture for 7 more years. But by 1955, that patch finally failed.
So, the cause of death was clear, the job was done. But this is exactly where Dr. Harvey decides to bypass every ethical firewall in existence. Harvey, who had been a massive fan of Einstein for years, instructs his 2 assistants to leave the room. And he doesn't do this for a moment of silence to pay his respects. Instead, in complete silence, he shaves Albert Einstein's head. He carefully opens up the skull, and he removes the gray matter. All of this is done without a single shred of permission. He faced potential jail time for this, knowing full well Einstein's final wishes were to be cremated intact. But he stole the century's most valuable biological processor anyway, slipping it into a jar and sneaking it off to a lab at the University of Pennsylvania.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer disappointment Harvey must have felt upon analyzing his stolen prize. Convinced that the secret to genius lay in raw mass, he immediately put the brain on a scale. An average human male brain weighs about 1,350 grams. Einstein's brain? It weighed in at just 1,230 grams. It was actually lighter than average. The hardware specs were completely underwhelming. Dr. Harvey was forced to instantly conclude that human intelligence cannot simply be measured by the raw weight or size of the brain.
Well, when raw size didn't provide the answers, Harvey's quest for data became frantic. If the secret wasn't in the weight, he figured it must be in the layout, right? The convolutions, the winding folds, the deep grooves of the cerebral cortex. So he systematically photographed the brain from every conceivable angle. Then he began the physical breakdown, slicing the brain up for microscopic viewing. He did this hundreds of times, taking obsessive notes. He even took a microscope home, continuing his unauthorized experiments in his own basement, hiding the jars away from the rest of the world.
240. That is the gruesome reality of what happened to the mind behind the theory of relativity. Harvey meticulously chopped the brain of a world-renowned theoretical physicist into 240 bite-sized cubes. He broke the physical entity down into hundreds of individual data packets just so he could study them under a microscope. And then, well, he wrapped up his research, released absolutely nothing to the public, and simply vanished off the grid with his jars.
For over 2 decades, the stolen cargo remained entirely unaccounted for. It wasn't until 1978 that a journalist named Stephen Levy managed to track Dr. Harvey down to a house in Wichita, Kansas. Levy knocked on the door, confronted Harvey, and asked point blank if he still had Einstein's brain.
Harvey initially denied it, but then, surprisingly, he caved. He led the journalist to a little storage room in the back of his house, and I'm just going to break the fourth wall here for a second as a warning. Just in case you ever trust a third party to safeguard your most vital personal data, you might really want to see how Dr. Harvey was storing the genius of the 20th century. It was sitting in a cardboard box labeled Costa Ciders. I mean, that is the ultimate indignity. The physical manifestation of unparalleled human brilliance, a brain that literally changed our entire understanding of space and time, was found floating in liquid inside glass jars, just casually stashed inside an old cider box in a Kansas storage closet. When Stephen Levy published his detailed article exposing this, it caught the media's eye immediately. But honestly, the most cynical part? At that point, the consensus was that Harvey hadn't even discovered anything out of the ordinary.
But the story doesn't end in that Kansas closet. In 1982, the narrative takes another turn. Dr. Harvey, perhaps feeling the heat or finally deciding to crowdsource his stolen data, decided to distribute pieces of his treasure. He sent out histological slides and photographs of the brain slices to 18 prominent researchers. He essentially booted up an unauthorized peer-to-peer network of stolen biological data.
And this distribution to those 18 researchers eventually resulted in 6 major scientific publications, and they finally found something. While Einstein's overall brain anatomy showed almost no difference from a normal brain, they discovered that his parietal lobes were noticeably larger than what is considered normal. This is a particularity that has actually been observed in other great physicists and mathematicians. So, after decades of unauthorized data distribution, the scientific community finally got the anomaly they felt somehow justified the theft.
So the crucial point is this historical event perfectly mirrors the absolute darkest practices of modern tech, data harvesting. The unauthorized extraction, storage, and distribution of personal information for third-party benefit. Dr. Harvey performed an unauthorized extraction of Einstein's biological data. He stored it insecurely in a cider box for decades, and then he distributed it to third parties so they could publish papers and benefit from it. Harvey ran the exact same playbook used by modern companies scraping your private digital life without your consent, just played out in 1955 with a scalpel instead of an algorithm.
And here is the really grim, dark reality of this entire breach. You would think the man who stole Albert Einstein's brain would face total ruin, but Dr. Thomas Harvey never got into any legal trouble whatsoever. He walked away completely clean. Einstein's family, perhaps just wanting to maintain the privacy Albert had always craved, never even gave an official response to the story. And the scientific community? They arguably benefited from it, happily consuming and publishing the harvested data without ever really questioning the deeply unethical jailbreak that procured it in the first place.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We live in an era where we constantly click accept on terms of service we don't read, trusting that our most private data is secure and respected. But history tells a very different, very cynical story. Albert Einstein explicitly opted out. He wanted his hardware destroyed. Yet the moment he was vulnerable, his bodily privacy was violated, chopped into 240 pieces and boxed up in a cider carton. If the scientific and medical community couldn't even respect the final dying privacy wishes of the greatest mind of the 20th century, what makes you think anyone out there is respecting yours? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer. Stay secure, and I'll see you on the next one.